Good morning. This is Michael Baker. Thank you for joining me to discuss international friction and potential world conflicts. I believe there are a number of potential catastrophes brewing around the world that we all need to take notice of, even though we're quite busy with other things. So not all of you know me. Some of you know me from prior lectures, but for those who are new, I need to give you a little bit of an introduction to explain why I'm lecturing on this topic. Many of you know I've been in medicine for 50 years. I'm a general and trauma surgeon. I teach surgery as well as still perform it. But that's not why I give these lectures. I mean, you have to wonder, why is a general surgeon lecturing on future warfare, foreign policy, strategy, threats to the USA, and related topics? Well, I had this parallel second career. I decided after my surgery training and fellowship to serve my country, and I was going to sign up to do a 2-year tour in the military as kind of my way of paying back. I thought it was a way to use my surgery skills to pay back. And so this is me signing up and taking my oath of office, commissioned as a lieutenant in the United States Navy. And you can see I still had hair, which means it's pre-children. This is my first file photo after I was promoted to lieutenant commander, where you get 2.5 stripes on your uniform. And you can see that my uniform is fairly bereft of any adornment or color at this point, having been in only for a short time. I had that 2-year plan to do surgery and maybe teach surgery, but I was assigned to a special warfare unit as a general medical officer to help them with their deployment planning and their deployments to other countries. And then while I was there, they encouraged me to become a qualified warfare officer in riverine warfare and coastal patrol, which was obviously way out of my skill set and was kind of a shocking idea to me, but it got me into the real Navy, which was really interesting. And that's probably what hooked me. And then they took me into operational deployments, and I had to go learn about flight medicine and diving medicine. And I learned all kinds of things outside my normal skill sets. Then they sent me into medical intelligence, which is scoping places out to figure out what the medical threats are and what our response would be to a deployment or an exercise. And then I got into exercise and war planning. So my 2-year plan continued to evolve, and I learned new skills about communications and intelligence and weapons, navigation, diesel engine repair, jacuzzi pumps, map reading. This is way pre-GPS. And even got to learn how to rappel down hillsides or mountains, went on coastal patrol, did all kinds of stuff outside of my normal skill set. And I added a few things over that first 10 years to my uniform. As you can see, I became a qualified river and coastal patrol combat craft officer in charge, which was unheard of that a medical officer had this warfare designator. I also earned my combat action ribbon with the U.S. Marine Corps. You can see it also gets a globe and anchor on it was for my deployment in Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And when this was over, I came back to be a commanding officer of a 1,200 member commissioned unit, where you have your own budget and your own judicial authority, and you can pretty much hire and fire like you would just a regular unit in the military. So at that point, after a decade, my operational assignments morphed into strategy and higher level planning stuff. I did humanitarian missions to Thailand and Cambodia. I did medical intelligence for Naval Forces Central Command in case we went back to do action in the Middle East or Persian Gulf region. I was still, by this point, teaching combat casualty care in places like Latvia, Egypt, and Korea. And I was the president's trauma surgeon for the G7 conference in Italy in '93. The president, when he travels to a country where they're not satisfied with their own medical care, will often bring their own surgical team, complete with a heart-lung machine and a whole crew of people who could take care of him if necessary. My strategic planning career went forward with more war and contingency planning as I got the higher rank. I was involved in joint military exercises where we looked at these plans in places like Korea and Thailand, Japan, and Egypt. I met and worked with some of the military officers you see in the news or on the news today. Names like Admiral James Stavridis, who we'll hear from later this morning, General John Kelly, Malcolm Nance, an intelligence officer who's a superb theorist and intelligence gatherer. And I'm still teaching combat casualty care and advanced trauma life support for the military when they ask me to. My whole perspective changed when I was posted to the U.S. Strategic Command. I kind of joke about that's where this global command is where Dr. Strangelove meets the defense of the homeland. And that's because they're involved in basically aiming their strategic ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads on other countries and assessing what might come back to affect this country and how we can defend the homeland, basically. It was really pretty amazing. So all my strategic assignments, Naval Forces Central Command, U.S. Strategic Command, Deputy Surgeon for Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, and the Commander of Naval Marine Corps Medical Forces Korea, which was commissioned active duty unit where you actually get your own challenge coin that you have to take with you everywhere you go. And by the time my 30 years in uniform had passed, I actually did have some color and adornment on my uniform. I had a few ribbons for my deployments and awards. You can see my warfare pin above my ribbons, and also I wear the broad stripe of the Rear Admiral, which you can see compared to my first one. Quick disclaimers, the talk has some graphic bits in it. Everything here can be backed up with open source material. My statements are my own opinions, don't reflect the Department of Defense, the Department of the Navy or Marine Corps, or the OLLI or DVC programs. I don't have anything monetary to declare. I don't do politics. I really try to stay away from it, but I will use some clips of politicians because they are often the world leaders making these decisions. And I'll try not to swear like a sailor, which is much easier now that since January 20th. Political science, and I want to talk about global friction and conflict. First, we'll start with the factors that contribute to this. The first is ethnic tension. We see this everywhere, whether it was Ireland with the religious strife there or strife between the Rohingya in Burma, which is terrible. Religious intolerance fits into that as well. Muslim versus Hindu in India, which we'll talk about. Populism, the rise of autocratic, neo-fascist kinds of groups, which currently we're having a problem with in this country. Nationalism, which is fueling some of what's going on in Russia and other countries. Boundary disputes are crucial. We're going to talk about Kashmir, where India and Pakistan clash, along with a little bit of input from China, as you'll see. And we're going to talk about resource competition. We'll talk about Iran and how that resource competition for their oil involved probably some errors that have led to the friction we have today. And future resource competition will also contribute. Other contributing factors, disruption in the balance of power. We'll talk about when a rising power confronts a new, an older power that's been around for a while. And disruption of the status quo. Let's say things have always been going well for a while, but something pops up that changes how business has been going. Perceived unfairness or injustice. This is often the cause of problems with the ethnic or the racial or the religious injustices. A new threat or a crisis popping up. I'll give you a few examples as we go forward. And often in a conflict, you find that one party is authoritarian or a totalitarian regime. You rarely find this as a problem with democracies. And usually one party will have confidence in their successful outcome. And many times there's a specific trigger. That trigger can be that there's an opportunity. You see that there's a coup d'etat or civil unrest that weakens a leader, or an assassination that generates that opportunity. You can see a threat like a secret weapon or weapons of mass destruction, the fear of which drove us to wrongly invade Iraq based on bad intelligence. And you can, again, the perceived injustice over territory, over religious, whatever, but those things provide the opportunity. Triggers, and sometimes that trigger is just a surprise you didn't expect. These are crisis creators, events not foreseen by the leadership. They cannot be ignored because they are so serious. An example would be the 1948 blockade of Berlin by the Soviet Union. So that, what should the response be? Should it be to go all out war to rescue Berlin? Should it be ignore it and just let them starve Berlin? Should it be something in between, like we did with the Berlin airlift? 1956, the Suez Canal was nationalized by President Nasser of Egypt, and several countries invaded to take the canal. Israel, France, Great Britain took the canal, and the U.S. stepped in to prevent a wider global conflict. But it was not foreseen. 1962, the U.S. discovered that the USSR was putting ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads in Cuba. That was quite a surprise that could have left us in a situation of global conflict, because things were to the point where people were building bomb shelters and we were being taught in schools how to duck and cover under your desk, like that was going to help you in the event of a nuclear attack. China taking control of the South China Sea, which we'll talk about today, but that's the most current one. So I think if we're going to look at risk to the United States, we have to categorize, is it a big risk, a little risk? Does it have critical impact on U.S. interests? Well, I would say that what China's doing, the current conflict in Afghanistan, what North Korea is up to, those are critical impacts on U.S. interests. Somewhat less critical, but still significant impact on U.S. interests are the situation in Russia involving Ukraine and Crimea, the Syrian civil war, friction in the Middle East can involve us, and limited impact on our interests. Those would be places like civil wars in Yemen, that could pull us into a wider global conflict. So, when we categorize these, as I give you my top 10, we're going to be looking at how they really impact U.S. security. So let's examine some of today's crisis zones. And I'm going to give you literally my top 10 with the help of this famous guy.
Ladies and gentlemen, here's tonight's top 10 list. Let's go.
My top 10 list is much more serious ramifications. So let's start with number 10, which is friction south of the border. This is very serious. It has to do with several risks, one of which is narco-terrorism and the war on drugs, the persistent violence in Mexico, the anti-government protests and economic collapse in Venezuela, the climate and economic crises of Central America leading to refugees coming here in greater numbers. This is really destabilizing events on our southern border, which are serious. And south of the border, we have 20 countries and 14 territories with 652 million people as of last year, 13% of the world's land surface area. And these are the countries we're going to be talking about in this region. And they've really been pretty much ignored, as my friend James Stavridis, who was a 4-star in charge of Southcom, which is the commander of this area that would deal with the southern countries here in Central and South America. He said, we really haven't done a good job in bringing South America along with us as we go forward. And he had a lot of ideas, some of which we're going to talk about as we go into this subject deeper. Let's start with Mexico, our closest neighbor. In the 2018 Mexican presidential election, 130 candidates and politicians were killed. I thought politics in this country were fairly divisive. That's a staggering number. In 2018, there were over 33,000 drug-related homicides, which is also pretty horrifying. And since 2006, there have been over 150,000 drug-related deaths. The number's going up. It's pretty serious. And Mexican cartels are considered by many to be the greatest drug-related threat because of their supply of heroin and meth and everything into the U.S., according to the DEA. Let's look at Venezuela. So I'm going to touch on a couple different areas real quick. Authoritarian countries supported by Cuba, Russia, and China, who are happy to increase our discomfiture. They have large oil supplies, which previously fueled a fairly decent economy, but has been a problem lately. The anti-government protests broke out against the Maduro government because of election fraud, and this has gone on and gone forward. And in 2016, the U.S. and other countries responded by pursuing a regime change. They also increased the sanctions on Venezuela, and the diplomacy grew more belligerent. We'll talk more about those problems, but what happened is between the fall in oil prices and the sanctions, what we got in Venezuela was an economic collapse. This generated a humanitarian crisis, particularly with food shortages and shortages of medicine. Their electrical system somehow failed and has been an ongoing problem. And this led to 3.4 million and probably more since 2015 refugees who have fled, half of whom wound up in Colombia, which is nearby. And you can look this up. It's on the UN refugee website. It's on this website here at the bottom of the screen. So going on to one more spot of friction south of the border, let's talk about Central America, the countries we refer to as the Northern Triangle of Central America, which are Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And they all have violence problems. They're all serious, frail nations. They have ineffective and corrupt governments. They have grinding poverty. There's just not enough food or healthcare, education. There's no opportunity. And, you know, for people to have hope, they have to have opportunity. And they have a recent upsurge in climate-caused catastrophes. They've had both droughts and storms and floods and things that have led to crop failures that led to more refugees, of course. Historically, there's been a U.S. domination of the Western Hemisphere, which has not always been a good thing. Teddy Roosevelt said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far." The Monroe Doctrine in 1823, where the U.S. Denied European intervention in the Americas, TR was kind of extending this to what we would call the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, that we would be the policemen of the Western Hemisphere and intervene in any Latin American country where we thought we should, based on our military force to correct chronic wrongdoing that would threaten regional stability. Guatemala, Honduras, and Central America, El Salvador, they all have significant violence problems. And there's a lot of reasons. They have very ineffective and fairly corrupt governments, and their civil institutions are not strong. They have grinding poverty for forever, with lack of adequate food, lack of health care, poor education. They have climate-caused catastrophes because of recent droughts and storms, which have caused significant impact on the ability to grow food or conduct transportation. Historically, the U.S. has dominated the Western Hemisphere, and we haven't done it. When I look back, there are some things that kind of astonish me. You may remember learning in school that Teddy Roosevelt said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far." A great quote, unless they're a recipient of the big stick. This was an extension of the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, which pretty much said, keep the Europeans out of the Americas. The Roosevelt corollary to this in 1904 was that the U.S. would be the policeman of the Western Hemisphere and intervene in any Latin American country when it felt that it was appropriate. And we would use military force as an international police power to correct wrongdoing or anything that threatens our stability. So how did we use it, the Roosevelt corollary? Well, we used it over a dozen times in the immediate 20 years after Roosevelt's statement all over Latin America. The rationale was instability or sometimes left-leaning governments in places like Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Haiti, and over places like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Panama, which were protectorates. So how does that lead to us being seen by the South Americans in the lens of history? Well, we helped take Panama from Colombia so that we could get that canal built, for better or worse. We supported an absolutely atrocious dictator in Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, but he got our support and our money because he always voted with the U.S. and the United Nations. That was a big thing. We supported Somoza family dictatorship dynasty in Nicaragua for generations. The CIA and the Contras were working against the Nicaraguan government on numerous occasions. And we did other little events like the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, which did not endear us to people in South America, nor make them trust the United States. let's take a listen to one survivor.
Nada menos que John Foster Dulles, que era el
No less a figure than John Foster Dulles, head of the State Department, was part of the firm of lawyers acting for the United Fruit Company. His brother Alan was the head of the CIA. So it didn't take much of an effort on their part to persuade their president, a military man, Mr. Eisenhower, to give them the green light to overthrow Arbentz's government.
Para derrocar al gobierno de Arbenz.
U.S. Secretary of State Dulles takes the rostrum to urge united action by the Americas to outlaw international communist intervention in the Western Hemisphere.
It's kind of an interesting event because, you know, the Dulles brothers were both legal guys who worked in conjunction with and for the United Fruit Company. So it had a lot to do with how they wanted to influence events in Central America. And one of the things that they didn't want to do was do anything that would tip over the balance of power, like in Guatemala, where the United Fruit Company owned about 50% of Guatemala at the time and kind of ran the country without paying much taxes. So we got to look forward to doing something different in Central America. We've got to engage Central America in a more hopeful fashion, I think. In the recent administration, just left office, the goals were preventing migration under the Trump administration. That was big. Improving U.S. business prospects, just like the Dulles brothers were doing. Cracking down on narco-terrorism and the flow of narcotics, not a bad thing. And they did it by threatening to end all foreign aid to these frail governments. And you can look that up. But if you look at how our foreign aid appropriations went for Central America, in the congressional budget record, you can see that it went down from over the 4 years of this last administration, almost 50%, which probably doesn't help some of these countries. So at the same time, you know, the apprehensions in the lower left corner, you can see this chart, the apprehensions of people fleeing the violence and poverty of the Northern Triangle, as they're called, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, went up quite substantially. So the questions for us to ask as scholars of this area is the stability of Central and South America important to the security of the United States? And I think we could all say yes, because clearly what's going on now has been somewhat harmful, and we need to change all these problems, whether it's the economic poverty or the flow of refugees or the flow of narcotics. We need to, you know, work on that, and the violence in Mexico. So the refugee crisis is still a problem, and it's just always there. It's been there for every presidential administration. All these things we need are reasons why I think we need to be engaged. We tend to have sort of not been very much engaged in these areas because, you know, when you're the president of the United States and you have 50 crises at a time, if this one is fairly quiet, maybe you're not focused on it too much. But I think it's an area where my friend Admiral Stavridis, who was the commander of SOUTHCOM, which is the strategic command for South America, he said basically, we have always underrated South America. They have the potential to really be our great friends and allies, but we have 100 years of colonialism and hegemony that we need to kind of correct and help. So as an example, I think John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the president, knew somewhat what to do, had a really great idea. I wish we could bring it back in a sense. It was called the Alliance for Progress, which he put forward in 1961. He wanted to support the civil society organizations and the local groups on the ground. This led to an annual 2.5% increase in per capita income. It was a great savior for the economy at the time and helped the democratic governments to be established. And it worked. One of its plans was to get rid of adult illiteracy, which is huge in that part of the world. Their goal was to do it by 1970. So let's listen to Kennedy, truly one of my heroes.
For too long, my country, the wealthiest nation in a continent which is not wealthy, failed to carry out its full responsibilities to its sister republics. We have now accepted that responsibility. In the same way, those who possess wealth and power in poor nations must accept their own responsibilities. They must lead the fight for those basic reforms which alone can preserve the fabric of their societies. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable.
Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. And I think that's what you've seen in Venezuela recently. So let's go on to our next friction site. And I'd say it was number 9, but really numbers 6 through 9 all kind of fit together in this area of the world where we see Iran and Afghanistan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Tunisia, Yemen. There are enough wars there that any one of them, any of these conflicts could be the next big problem area. And let's take a look at them. I always kind of joke, I like Mark Twain's statement about God created war so that Americans would learn geography, and you know, all these events of how we've learned where Afghanistan is and where Pakistan is, and so it's been good for us. So let's start with what I think is number 9, the Syrian civil war and the Islamic State. We put a tremendous amount of resources into this. It began in 2011 against President Assad of Syria, the rebel forces that wanted to overthrow his government. The rebellion and regime change was supported by the USA, the Turkeys, the Saudi Arabians. Again, regime change, big key word here, I think, in some of these sites where we're deciding if it's really our job to do this. Russia and Iran at that time supported Assad to keep him in power. And while all this was going on in the background, the Islamic State emerges. Another threat changes this conflict, which sort of had maybe 2 or 3 sides, to literally a Rubik's Cube. So look at began in 2011. Here we are 10 years into the Syrian civil war. It's not over. So it did become a Rubik's Cube of agendas and forces fighting against each other with different goals. The Syrian rebels, the US coalition forces, mostly European, and the Kurds were against Assad to try and overthrow his government. At the same time, the US and Turkey and Iraq and Iran were fighting against ISIS, initially quite ineffectively. Turkey and Assad started attacking the Kurds, changing the whole dynamics of this region overnight. And then the Russians started attacking the Kurds and the Syrian rebels. So again, you have this sort of a very complex diagram of who's favoring who and who's attacking who and who's disrupting whose forces. So it's not clear to me that there is any one goal here that's going to be really easy. So these are all areas of friction and risk. You know, the Kurds versus Syria, and they're against the Syrian rebels, and they're against Turkey and Russia and ISIS, who are not gone. And Iraq completely got destabilized and needed another boost from the US after 20 years of us being in Iraq. And, you know, it led to the rise of ISIS and, you know, kind of unlimbered Al-Qaeda to do a lot of damage in that part of the world. So it is a Rubik's Cube. If I can make it more clear, maybe, I don't know. The USA wanted Assad out and the Syrian rebels to take over because they thought it would be a more pro-US government. Is our job to seek regime change? I don't know, we'll see. The Turks and the Russians and the Iranians wanted to support Assad for various reasons. The Russians wanted a warm water port and an air base there, which they have now. The Iranians are ethnically linked. The USA supports the Kurds, and the Kurds also helped us aggressively oppose ISIS, which at one point, so did the Turkey. Turkey was theoretically a USA partner in NATO, but it's playing footsie with Russia. They're playing all sides of this game, and hard to know what's going on with their current leadership. And they vigorously attacked the Kurds, you know, when we tweeted our way out of northern Syria and left the Kurds unsupported, which was a terrible diplomatic move. Let's take a peek at that part of the world real quick.
Russian state media showed commandos staging what looked like a military invasion. The Russians are playing up the takeover of the Kobani airfield as a victory. The former U.S. airbase that served as a main logistical hub for America's fight against ISIS, now with a Russian flag flying over it. The Russians moved in just a day after U.S. forces moved out, leaving behind barracks, beds, abandoned medical supplies, and the skeleton of a gym, weights removed to render it useless. The same can't be said of the runway, however, an American-made landing strip now under Russian management. The repositioning of U.S. troops mean their footprint has been reduced to patrolling oil fields while partnering with America's Kurdish allies on the ground. Even top Kurdish commander Mazloum Kobani lamented that the sudden U.S. retreat left him no choice but to turn to the Russians. We had an understanding with Russia to avoid Turkish attacks in this region, he said. The vacuum Americans left behind, we had to fill with the Russians.
Wow, interesting. So we tweeted our way out of northern Syria. We stabbed the Kurds in the back, despite the fact that they fought with us for almost a decade against ISIS. And now they're turning to the Russians because we can't be trusted. Great diplomacy. So what are the results of this 10-year conflict in this part of the world? Well, if you look at the UN statistics, they say about 400,000 people killed in Syria. Many of them are civilians. 5.6 million people fled the country. 6 million are internally displaced because of the destruction and the famine. And you can look this up on the global tracker. There's lots of places you could find this information and try and verify it. So what does that mean? What's that like to have a couple of million refugees? So I'm not sure that our moves there have really been helpful, but I think there is a lot of good we can still do. But what worries me now and why it's number 9 is there's a trigger risk for an unintended escalation. Why do I say that? Well, we've got Iran, Iraq, Israel, Qatar, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the Syrians all operating aggressive military forces in this area, along with the Kurds and others. And we have Turkey, which is a NATO ally, the US and US-led coalition forces also. They're operating in close proximity to the Russians. Could trigger a conflict. So when we're thinking about this from the strategic point of view and why we worry, well, start with, was Assad a threat to the USA national security? Was it right for us to go after Assad, whether he was fighting a civil war or using a chemical weapon? Was this the right thing to do? Something for us to just think about and mull over long term. Did it make sense for the USA to seek a regime change? Is that our job, and would that have made any difference? Would it have been a new leadership been better than the old leadership? We can look to Vietnam for an example like that, where we got rid of Diem and put in somebody else. So, you know, did it make sense, and did it improve things? Have we made the region more safe and stable? Well, I think we know the answer to that one after a decade. And who benefits so far? Well, clearly the Russians benefit because of not only do they have military bases in Syria, but they took over some of the military bases and structures that we built, not to mention the fact that diplomatically, we certainly don't look very good. And, you know, if you were looking at the economics, what's our return on investment? What did we get out of being in Syria for all these years? And was it really the right thing to do? I'm not even sure. Well, because it's so complicated, none of this is an easy question to answer. You know, was the ISIS fight our fight? Were they a threat to national security? Something to think about. Certainly, we didn't like them. We thought they were very horrible, what they did to many, many people. I'm not sure that was our fight. Something to think about. Maybe it was our fight. So let's look at number 8. All these tie together because they're all in proximity. In 1948, the State of Israel was established by the United Nations mandate. It was immediately attacked by the armies of Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq in an amazing conflict, literally right after the UN vote. Ultimately, Israel managed to survive despite not having formal armies that the other countries had, basically arming refugees coming off the boats and putting them into the salvage of the country. The war ended with kind of three distinct geographic areas that we have to talk about today. The state of Israel as we know it, the area of Gaza, and then the area of the West Bank. So, one of the big problems left over now for many, many years is that the Palestinians who were displaced were never allowed to integrate into the neighboring countries of Jordan, Egypt, and Lebanon. In Egypt, they were kept in Gaza. They couldn't come into Egypt. In Lebanon, they were kept in camps for years. So it just kind of kept things festering now for, almost 75 years. So when you look at the Israeli map, here it is as the UN did the plan of partition. And, it's a little skinny blue country with these three areas that are somewhat tan when they laid it out here in 1948. That's the UN Commission map. At some points, the country was only about 18 miles from the border to the sea. So really a vulnerable little place when it was attacked. And since 1948, there's constant friction between the Israelis and the Palestinians and the surrounding countries. Although recently that's changed a little bit because Israel's been recognized by Jordan and Egypt, and also by Morocco, Bahrain, Sudan, UAE, in a diplomatic process called the Abraham Accords, which is named after the fact that they're all Abrahamic religions. And the map, if you were to look at it today, because of the various wars and conflicts, you can see that the country has, the territorially has changed a little bit. You can still see that Gaza and the West Bank are somewhat different and distinct, but that Israel has really consolidated a bit of the territory and gotten a bit stronger. So there's always been a special relationship between the United States and Israel, and one of the big reasons is they're strategic partners in opposing Soviet influence, now Russian influence, but they've been our big strategic partners, and they've been cooperating in the counterterrorism fight quite a bit, particularly with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and some of the other groups, because of their knowledge of the Middle East and the players, which was very difficult. They've been partners in opposing nuclear proliferation, and on several occasions actually took aggressive steps, like to take out the nuclear reactor in Baghdad. I'm sure glad they don't have one, and probably delayed this part of the world getting nuclear weapons for another 30 years. And, it's an educated, very high-tech, Western-style democracy, which is different than all the other countries in that part of the world. So, we just have a different relationship. But conflict resolution in this part of the world is very difficult and going to be very difficult to go forward. It's unlikely that Israel is going to concede more than they've already offered in multiple other peace talks that have gone on in Oslo and at Camp David and, on and on for all these years. The Palestinians have rejected them. The Palestinian Authority is not likely to actually write down the words that the state of Israel can exist. That's been kind of their line in the sand. They want to destroy Israel, which doesn't make for good neighbors. The political divisions between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority mean that even the Palestinian areas of the West Bank and Gaza don't exactly play off the same sheet of music nor see eye to eye in their efforts going forward. They still continue to be a lot of missiles and incendiary bomb attacks to provoke Israel, and Israel retaliates because it's very hard not to retaliate when that stuff falls on your schools and cities. Outside countries fuel the conflict, particularly Iran right now, has been supporting Hamas and Hezbollah and the other terrorist guys in the region to, keep the conflict going. So how do we get a peaceful solution? Where do we go from here? All these years, everybody's failed. Jimmy Carter's failed, Bill Clinton's failed, Kushner failed. What a surprise. The surrounding nations and Hezbollah add fuel to the fire, and that's a bad thing. that will bring us to one of our other conflicts as we go forward here. Palestinians remain in camps rejected from the surrounding Arab countries, which is kind of interesting because in most other refugee situations, the refugees got integrated and, often contributed to the society where they were integrated. Probably something that should be diplomatically worked out. Our peace attempts, as I mentioned, haven't done real well. Do we have a solution? 2 states, 1 state, there's a bunch of solutions and nobody's agreed so far. I think we need a new plan, a new strategy going forward. I'm not an expert in this. There's a lot of guys working on it. So we need to find for our group, when we're thinking about this as potential historians and diplomats and political scientists, is there a solution? Should we continue to try and broker peace? Should the USA be in this conflict? And we all need to think about that as we go forward here. I think there's value to it since it is a Western style democracy that's a strategic partner that opposes terrorism and other malign influences. What's our return on investment? That's a hard one to quantify. We're looking for stability, I think, ultimately, and maybe a promotion of democratic ideals. And we'll have to see what our ROI is on that. Is there a downside to continue supporting Israel? Well, now that some of the surrounding countries are opening diplomatic relations with Israel, it's very interesting because there's actually trade and tourism that hasn't been present for many years. And those of you who heard my talks before know that I think that is a great way to help foster goodwill. And why did the Trump administration cut off aid to the UN Relief and Works Agency? That was an interesting decision to make people more miserable and more poor and more sick, just like we did with foreign aid in Central America. Was that really the right decision? And why do surrounding nations fail to intervene in a positive way? So, things that we have to work on, if rather than cutting off aid, maybe the way to do it is to make a way to ensure that your aid goes to the right people for the right reasons, and that maybe the surrounding countries really get invested in a solution. Up until now, they've been invested in friction because it suits their purposes. When you have an outside enemy, if you have a failing country, you can always blame it on your outside enemy. So there's a lot of work to be done here. But again, all these countries are in proximity and these conflicts are multiple-sided in my Rubik's Cube. So one of the key players in this zone is Iran. There's a lot of reasons for this, but if you look at the map and you can follow my cursor, it's right up against Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's right up against Iraq. It's close to Syria, and it's across the water from Saudi Arabia. If you're a Saudi, you call that the Saudi Arabian Sea, but it's always been called the Persian Gulf. So, and then down here is Yemen. So these conflicts, they all weave together. Why is Iran in conflict with the USA for many years? Well, there's a couple reasons. The starting point for the talk here is that in 1953, there was an elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh. He was overthrown in a coup organized by, lo and behold, the CIA and Britain's MI6. Let's take a look at some of the history of this.
1950, 40% of the West's oil was being produced in Iran and 75% of Europe's. This reliance on Iranian oil had caused the British to become deeply entrenched in Iran's politics. Britain would soon find itself in a similar predicament. Inspired by the developments in Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, the Iranians too began to demand a fairer share of the profits. The demand for a revision of the concession, giving Iran 50% of the profits and a larger role in the management of the company, were rejected by Britain. On January 11, 1951, the National Front, a moderate nationalist party headed by Mohammad Mossadegh, proposed the nationalization of Iran's oil. Mossadegh hoped the nationalization would boost Iran's economy to help prevent communism taking root. Mossadegh became a hero not just in the Middle East, but all over the world. His dedication to democratic values and his relentless pursuit of democratic reforms inspired people around the globe. In 1951, he was named Time of the Year by Time magazine in recognition of his achievements. Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary under the Churchill government, along with British MI6 intelligence agents, began a campaign to convince the new president that Mossadegh had to be removed if communism were to be prevented from spreading in the region. With no oil settlement in sight, Eisenhower became concerned that Iran's increasingly worse economic situation would provide fertile ground for the spread of Soviet influence.
So somehow, a country that produced 40% of the US oil and 70% of Europe's oil and was promoting democracy, got in the crosshairs. And what was the tool that they used? The tool that they used was to brand him as a communist, which was interesting. So we overturned his government. We got the Shah in, and he ruled with an iron fist, assisted by General Schwarzkopf, not the general under whom I served, that's his son, but this is the World War II generation General Schwarzkopf, who helped him set up Savak, which is the Secret Service. So that went on until 1979, from 1953 to 1979, and the revolution ousted the pro-American Shah because of a lot of problems with their society. The Shah was replaced with anti-American Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been in exile in France. Iran goes from being a monarchy to a Shiite theocracy ruled by a religious group. Let's take a look at a little bit more documentary. You might have to turn up your volume just a tad.
British MI6 and American CIA had already been in discussion over potential coup plots in November of 1952. However, under the Truman administration, the CIA still believed that supporting a staunch anti-communist like Mossadegh, rather than trying to overthrow him, was the surest way to prevent communism taking root. The discussions led to naught. During the same month, Anglo-Iranian officials met with Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt and head of CIA operations in the Middle East. The officials presented Kermit with a coup plot named Operation Boot. Roosevelt.
So what did this get us? Let's take a look.
The coup was a landmark event. It was the first successful coup carried out by the newly formed CIA and would become the model for all future CIA coup operations. But the true repercussions wouldn't be felt until decades later, following the Iranian Revolution in 1979. The CIA had helped remove a popular elected democratic leader and a man dedicated to the principles of democracy and liberty, and helped reinstate and strengthen the autocratic rule of the Shah. The US would continue to back the Shah's military oppressive regime as an American ally in the region until its eventual overthrow in the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The Shah's regime would be replaced with an Islamic Republic established by the Shia Muslim cleric Ayatollah Khomeini.
Interesting. So now we have friction from 1979 till now. You know, in 1979, the US embassy was breached and hostages were taken. It was a very horrible event. We've had no diplomatic relations with Iran since 1980. And since then, both sides have attacked each other's assets, the oil platforms, the tankers. There was a tanker attack just recently. There have been drone strikes, there have been assassinations. You know, we killed one of their generals around the first of the year. You know, there's continued friction, and sometimes it escalates, as we know. And in the interim, they've ramped up their nuclear program again. So we've tried to attempt to derail or delay their nuclear program. You know, there was, in 2010, there was a Stuxnet hack to shut down the uranium centrifuges. There have been a few unfortunate accidents occurring that killed Iranian nuclear experts. We've put more economic sanctions on Iran, which probably just harms, you know, the poor people. Let's take a look at one of these just for interest.
Something as simple and innocuous as this becomes a challenge for all of us to maintain accountability and control of our critical infrastructure systems. This actually contains the Stuxnet virus.
extent really think it required the resources of a nation state.
It was blowing up centrifuges and it was leaving no trace.
Kind of interesting. So our diplomacy during all this time has been a little erratic. 1953, we toppled an elective government who was painted as being pro-Soviet, but maybe wasn't. Who knows what the truth really is on that. We put in the Shah, who was very repressive, and supported him right up until the Ayatollah came into power in 1979, at which point we lost diplomatic relations. In 2015, we tried to have the JCPOA, which is the treaty between 6 countries and Iran, halt Iranian nuclear production. And it was this Security Council plus Germany, I believe, were the signatories. So we signed a treaty. US, France, Russia, China, UK, and Germany signed a treaty with Iran, which allowed inspectors in and halted uranium purification. Probably a good step. In 2018, we pulled the USA out of the signed agreement, a treaty which we had put our thumbprint on and said we will support. And I can't tell you how this makes us look as a nation keeping its promises or living up to its oaths, as it were. So our diplomacy has been very erratic. So here's friction zone number 7, the questions for us to think about. Do the Iranian people have a real case for mistrusting the US? Boy, I think that one is somewhat obvious by the way I presented some of this information. How do we define a good outcome? What's a desired outcome between the USA and Iran? Is it for normalized relations? Is it for nuclear disarmament? Is it for, resumption of trade? What is the desired outcome? Is it getting Iran to stop sponsoring regional terrorism? Got to think about what the outcome should be. Does the angry rhetoric and the sanctions and the hostile actions get us closer to a desired result? I think most of us kind of get the sense that if you don't think this through, it probably gets you closer to conflict. You may remember not so long ago, we were moving forces to the Middle East to push back in Iran, and that could have triggered something. We'll come to that one in a minute. So who's hurt by sanctions? I think sanctions hurt the middle class and poorer people. And, I don't think they hurt the people in power who continue to live off the top of the food chain. Are we a reliable ally when we pull out of the treaty that's signed by every but other, international power? Are we a reliable partner? Can we be trusted? Well, we don't look so good on that one. But what could opening up diplomacy and trade accomplish in this part of the world? I think it would be huge. And I think less sanctions and more diplomacy is probably where we need to be going. But again, these are things for all of us to think about. Let's go on and look at Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and their proxy conflict with Iran. As I said, this part of the world, it's all intertwined.
The Middle East is one of the most complex regions in the world. Currently, there are 4 failing states and 3 wars, with major powers increasingly taking opposite sides. Countless armed militias and terrorist groups are spreading violence across borders. The region has seen conflict after conflict going back well into the 20th century. But among all the uprisings, civil wars, and insurgencies, 2 countries always seem to be involved: Saudi Arabia and Iran. They're bitter rivals, and their feud is the key to understanding conflicts in the Middle East. The Saudis and Iranians have never actually declared war on each other. Instead, they fight indirectly by supporting opposing sides in other countries and inciting conflicts. This is known as proxy warfare, and it's had a devastating effect on the region. Countries, especially poor ones, can't function if there are larger countries pulling strings within their borders.
Both the Saudis and the Iranians see these civil wars as both tremendous threats and also potentially enormous opportunities.
So let's take a look at this area and these problems. So here we are, we're still friction zone 6 through 9, but this is number 6 on my list. The blue arrow is focused on the area where Saudi and Yemen are together, and there's a conflict there that could cause more problems around the world. The Saudis, it's a kingdom, it's a monarchy. It's Sunni by religion. They are nominal allies of the USA. I call them nominal allies because you don't know where they stand really, but they are big purchasers of US weapons and munitions. That's a biggie. And they rely on the USA for their security really. Why do we have friction in Yemen? Well, civil war began in 2015. Houthi rebels were rising up against the Yemen government, and the Houthi rebels were Shia Muslims supported by Iran, whereas the government was Sunni supported by Saudis. Saudi Arabia starts bombing Yemen and the Houthi rebels and opposite support for the government. And it really is an extension of the Iran-Saudi Arabia proxy conflict. As far as we know, they don't have their own troops in these areas much. So Saudi attacks targets in Yemen, and we'll take a peek at a comment about that midway through this conflict.
What is Saudi Arabia's biggest concern?
Well, Yemen is right on its border, and so what the Saudis, I think, are concerned about is two big things. One is instability and jihadi groups coming, infecting the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the other is the Houthis gaining strength and maybe gaining power in Yemen. What is clear is that the Saudis perceive a Shia government in Yemen as a big problem. The Saudis are hardcore Sunni, and they tend to be very anti-Shia. So you have religious stuff going on, but you also have this regional power game between Saudi Arabia on the one hand and Iran on the other. It's playing itself out in Syria, now it's playing itself out in Yemen. Okay. I think that's right. I mean, the presence of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they're always worried about chaotic badlands where jihadis may come to power. The real concern, this is why this is the first time the Saudis have initiated airstrikes, is they don't want a Shia government in Yemen. Just as if you remember, what was the last time the Saudis used military force? To help the government of Bahrain, which is a Sunni minority government, make sure that you didn't have the majority, which is the Shia, come to power. So both times the Saudis have used military power in the last few years, it has been to prevent a Shia government from becoming part of their neighborhood.
So, as we talked about when we started the lecture, it's pretty much of an ethnic-based conflict that the Saudi monarchy feels threatened by. So they invade Yemen. It's their proxy war, Sunni versus Shia. They initiate a major humanitarian crisis. It's huge. In the meantime, we're supplying the Saudis with overt support. Until recently, I think President Biden has cut down on the weapons and munitions and asked for a review of all our sales. ISR is intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. That's overflights and satellite imagery, things like that. We really helped the Saudis a lot. Clearly, we were doing with them sort of like what the Russians were doing with Assad. So the Houthis in Yemen strike back, just so you know, they weren't totally helpless because they're getting a little help. Maybe that's true. How did we respond? A couple of guys basically went to Radio Shack and got a couple of model airplanes and blew up 5% of the world's oil supply. It's a pretty staggering thought. We've always been on the launching end of drones, but drones are coming back our way one of these days. So we send more U.S. troops into harm's way. That's kind of what first thing we did. And we sent more U.S. warships into the region to kind of push back on the Iranians and the Houthis. We moved more heavy bombers into the area as a threat. And we provided more missile defense for Saudi Arabia. So, and then, like always, we put more sanctions, more economic pressure on Iran, which is already under grave sanctions that are pretty much really harming their economy. So that's how we respond. So our questions looking at this, political scientists, How does sending troops and ships and planes to Saudi Arabia fit into our national security strategy? And I think this is really, really, really crucial. You've got to ask yourself some questions. Is our national security at risk because of the Saudi-Houthi conflict with Iran on the other side? What benefit do we get from the Saudis in this conflict with Iran? I mean, is there a benefit here for the U.S.? It's a good question. Do we need Saudi oil? Is this a national security issue now like it was 25 years ago? I don't think so. And then the other question that bothers me immensely when we're dealing with actors in this part of the world is, do the Saudis share our democratic values? You know, there's some pretty crucial questions here. Do the Saudis promote free speech and free press? Well, we know about, the journalist Khashoggi, a Washington Post journalist. We know what happened to him and a lot of others who speak freely or try to. Are they proponents of women's rights and religious freedom in Saudi Arabia? Well, that's a laugh. 15 of the 19 9/11 plane hijackers were Saudis. So are they really our allies? Do they share our democratic values? And if they go to war with Iran, are we going to fight with the kingdom in order to protect their oil wells and their monarchy? I mean, that's a really toughie. These questions are very, very important. The answers are very difficult. I'm going to give you a special answer just to kind of lighten up. So, why is our strong support for this authoritarian Saudi monarchy that's repressive? Well, I'm going to give you kind of a humorous answer, but I think there's a lot of
the United States is more prepared than any country in the history in any history, if we have to go that way. And the Saudis want very much for us to protect them, but I say, well, we have to work. That was an attack on Saudi Arabia, and that wasn't an attack on us. But we would certainly help them. They've been a great ally. They spend $400 billion in our country over the last number of years. $400 billion. That's 1.5 million jobs. And they're not ones that, unlike some countries where they want terms. They want terms and conditions. They want to say, can we borrow the money at 0% for the next 400 years? No. Saudi Arabia pays cash.
Area of the world, they're going to pay for it. And for us to think a little bit more, some harder questions. Is this conflict between Saudi and Arabia a concern for our national security? Should we be unconditionally backing the Saudis, right or wrong, humanitarian crisis or not? Are they strong, reliable allies? Something to think about historically. Is this the appropriate use of U.S. military forces and weapons? Something, got to question that. And are there other foreign policy tools we could be using here? And yes, there are. So I'm going to suggest we leave the Middle East for a bit. I think I'm going to open the chat room for some questions if anybody has interest. I'm also going to suggest that maybe those of you who need a 2-minute break to fill your coffee cups or empty your bladder or stretch, this is a good time to do it. But, if you want to toss out a question or two, I'm going to kind of take a 2-minute break and stretch and see what if any questions pop up here. I think it would be kind of fun. If not, we've got a lot. And as you know, you have my email. We can always continue these discussions on email going forward. And I would be happy to communicate with any of you regarding my thoughts on this, because these are my thoughts. There's other perspectives. I might feel differently if I was growing up in another country, particularly. But I have to say that my view, as I dive deep into all these things, my view has changed a bit. And I think it's important for us to look at some of these issues and why are we doing this? So I've got a question from someone about what's my insight into Biden's decision to reduce support for the Saudis in Yemen. I think it's 10 years overdue, just my opinion. I don't think we needed to be in the conflict. I think selling weapons without getting something diplomatic in return, like diplomatic relations between the Saudis and Israel or diplomatic efforts to promote peace between Iran and the Saudis, I think just pushing more weapons so we can get more weapons sales is the wrong approach. I'm a big believer in diplomacy and in trade and tourism and in sharing culture. Question from Cindy about medical intelligence. Medical intelligence means when we write a war plan, and I'll give you an example, a war plan where North Korea invades South Korea and the US goes to war to defend South Korea. The medical intelligence would mean traveling that area and looking for disease threats to deployed troops, looking for medical treatment facilities that could be used by American forces, looking for a way to get American casualties treated, how to bring, American medical support into the region in the middle of a war. So medical intelligence is everything from disease threats to figuring out how many units of blood we would actually want to fly to that zone in the event that we went to a full-fledged conflict. The other kind of medical intelligence is the disease threats are important because if there's a humanitarian collapse, again, let's look at North Korea. We know they have about a 5% tuberculosis rate and a lot of malnutrition and many other diseases. We would have to respond, and knowing that in advance allows us to plan and actually have a plan written. And when you write a war plan, it's written right down to where are the supplies, what airplane are they going to fly on, where are they going to land, and what truck is going to pick them up. So, this stuff is called a time phase diagram. It's actually got a little longer name. But when you press the button, basically all the conveyor belts start to move and all the trucks and planes and people involved start to make things happen. So comment from Hugh about what should we do about Syria? I think it's a horrible, terrible conflict. And I'm not sure, I feel horrible that we let the Kurds down and kind of just cut them loose so they'd go be supported by the Russians. But also they had been our allies, so, it made us look very bad diplomatically. I think it's going to be a big problem. And somebody's asking me about the Poland and the Baltics. And hey, we're only on number 6, so give me 5 more and we'll get there. And I think it's going to be really important. And so let me go on with, since I think I answered almost everybody's question, I'll take a quick peek. I think we got pretty much everything. So let's go forward. I know everybody has things to do, but we've got some pretty important parts of the world. Number 5 is the Korean Peninsula. This has been in and out of the news. We've talked about it before. Historically, for those of you who aren't familiar, when World War II ended, and I'm going to start from that point, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel. Russia controlled the north. They had entered the war in the Pacific in the last weeks when they knew we were going to win. The USA controlled the south, and North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950. That's kind of what Americans know about Korea and the Korean War because they watched MASH on TV. But since 1953 and that armistice, the U.S. continued to support South Korea while the big supporter of North Korea is China. They're separated by a demilitarized zone, the DMZ, which is 2 kilometers wide and is full of mines and sensors and keep the people apart. There's no trade or anything going back and forth. They have very diametrically opposed political, economic, and social systems. There's a very robust South Korean economy. I love going to South Korea. It is amazing. You get into one of their very modern subway systems. You can use your phone to buy your ticket on the train or the subway. And after you get your ticket, it tells you what the weather and the pollen count is where you're going, which is, it's just amazing how they've jumped into the tech age. And you go aboard a Korean ship in their Navy, and the engine room looks like a dentist's office. It's spotless. Tremendous pride in their accomplishments. North Korea is moribund. Their economy is, as we'll show some pictures, is terrible. And there continues to be cross-border friction. There's been shellings with artillery. There's been sinking of ships. It seems to be mostly instigated by the North, from what I know of. We don't know for sure. So to give you a perspective, you got to know where you're going, because as Yogi Berra says, if you don't know where you're going, you might wind up somewhere else. particularly to write a war plan, you need to know where you're going to land that airplane and build that hospital. So this is Korea. You can see a star there at about 5 o'clock where the Korean peninsula juts out from China. So when you look at the big map, the Korean star is right here, and you can see China's the big bear right next to it. And China really dominates this region, but Russia's up there too. And at least in the initial part of the Korean War, the Russians were big supporters of weapons and training, and got the war started. Then the Chinese came in as well. So North Korea just keeps rolling on. It's a hermit kingdom. All outside information is controlled. The internet is very limited to government officials, almost no trade, and the borders are sealed pretty much as best they can. It's a very isolated place with a fair amount of brainwashing going on. They're fixated on developing nuclear weapons for regime survival. They feel it's crucial. They have gotten into developing long-range ballistic missiles so they can play my button's bigger than yours, depending on who they're dealing with. And they've been engaged in weapons and nuclear proliferation with other parties such as Iran and Pakistan for years. So there's a lot of evidence that the three of them have been working on nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles together. And they keep doing these provocative attacks into South Korea.
이번에 진행한 세용의 잠수함 탄도탄 북극성 사명 시험 발사의 성공은 조선민주주의인민공화국에 대한 외부 세력의 위협을 억제하고 나라의 자위적 군사력을 도한층 강화하는 데서 새로운 국면을 개척한 중대한 성과로 됩니다.
In the last year, North Korea has been launching a lot of missiles. They're all just tests, but they're meant to send a message. North Korea is armed and dangerous. They've demonstrated missiles that can destroy Seoul and Tokyo, hit US bases in the Pacific, and now one that can reach Alaska. So this raises the question, why is North Korea so dead set on building an ICBM? The North Koreans first got nuclear technology in the 1950s, when their ally, the Soviet Union, helped them build nuclear reactors for energy. At the same time, they were protected from their enemies, South Korea and the US, by the massive nuclear arsenal of the Soviet Union. But in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, that protection went away. So North Korean dictator Kim Jong-il took matters into his own hands and started using the nuclear reactors to make weapons. And there's a reason for that. See, the Kim dynasty believes their only option for security is to have proven nuclear capabilities. They saw the US invade Iraq and topple Saddam Hussein because they thought he might have nukes. They also saw Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi negotiate with the US and give up his nuclear program, only to be killed by US-backed rebels. The Kim dynasty is determined not to be next. So they've gone on to build an arsenal of missiles for their nuclear bombs.
That explains it fairly well, I think. It's all about regime survival and being relevant and listened to. And, so how do we deal with that? Well, if you have knowledge and diplomacy, this is how you do it. Or not.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. He has been very threatening beyond a normal statement. And as I said, they will be met with fire, fury, and frankly, power, the likes of which this world has never seen before.
셋째, 우리 국가와 인민을 상대로 저지르고 있는 미국의 극악한 범죄의 대가를 1100배로 결산할 것이다. 저들의 땅덩어리가 태양 건너에 있어 무사리라고 생각한다면 그보다 더 큰 오산은 없다.
Belligerent diplomacy, very smooth. So what do? You know, there was talk about attacking North Korea, right? We have the world's greatest military, but we also know what that might result in. We've seen it before. I mean, it's been a long time, but you know, it was a terrible war the first time, and now that there might be nukes, it would be a terrible disaster this time. It would affect the whole global economy in that part of the world. So what's our desirable outcome? Questions for Friction Area 5. Should we continue to isolate North Korea? Should we go to war and crush North Korea? Should we try to disarm the North Korean nuclear program? Is that a desirable goal? We want to reunify the Korean people in the peninsula. This is a tough one. You know, we have 77 years of hostility and still counting. You know, I don't know we've made a lot of progress as much as I'd like to see. So this hostility, you got to add it up and go, what have we accomplished so far? Well, the two Koreas are still separated and belligerent. It's a bad rivalry. Is this same process going to continue to work, or should we be shifting gears to do something different? Does the threat improve the outcome? Actually, when Trump fell in love with Kim in Singapore, I don't think that improved the outcome either, because there was really no plan, and the diplomacy again was erratic and sort of spontaneous, and wasn't followed through with very well. Are sanctions effective? North Korea has been impoverished all this time and continues to be impoverished. And who do they hurt? We talked about that. I think it hurts the lower class, not the government or the military. And is there a role for diplomacy? If we had smart diplomacy, what could we accomplish? Well, I think we could accomplish a lot. And I think going forward, that's where we need to go. The short answer for me is I think we need a mini Marshall Plan for North Korea, and we need to step in and help them build a country that functions and can join the rest of the global commons. Because when you put in an economy and you have trade, knowledge and ideas flow across there. So I'm not sure what we've been doing the last 77 years is where we need to keep going. But if we're going to do those things, you know, we should also know what we want to get in return. But I think that's where I'd go instead of threatening fire and fury. So, but let's go on, because somebody brought up a great question, which takes us to friction zone number 4. Engaging in aggressive cyber warfare and disinformation. We know the US has been hit by that, but many other countries as well, France and Ukraine. Russia against its neighboring states. We'll go to the map in a minute. They've ignored the Intermediate Nuclear Missile Treaty, and we're doing tests anyway. They've been touting their development of hypersonic missiles, which are a very scary tool that is very hard to have a defense against. They maintain complete control over the Russian media, so it's very hard to get anything information-wise into Russia now. They're also trying to put up a cyber firewall to keep out any contradictory information and to prevent, just like China's been doing where you can't get Google, prevent people from learning what else is going on in the world. So what are their latest exploits? Well, you know, they annexed Crimea, which is kind of interesting. Stalin gave Crimea to Ukraine after the war. They took it back. They invaded and destabilized Ukraine. You can remember the pictures and stories about the little green men who spoke Russian but had uniforms without any identifying patches, which is hilarious. We talked about their support of the Assad regime in Syria, and they are threatening the Baltic states, as one of our questioners asked today. There is clearly a threat. They move a lot of forces around in that neighborhood to make Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia feel uncomfortable. And they've closed the Black Sea to international navigation, which has caused a little bit of an uproar. So when you look at the map, you know, Russia there in the right corner at 1 o'clock, you know, it's a pretty big country with a lot of people and a humongous army. And the areas that they are threatening, Ukraine, Crimea is down here. They're threatening the Baltic states. Everybody here is at a little bit of a threat. But I think, you know, Crimea and Ukraine are the friction point where there is still actually active hostilities and combat taking place. Not so long ago, you know, an international airliner was shot down by either the pro-Russian rebel forces or the Russians themselves. Probably an error, we assume. But let's take a look at that part of the world, just so you get a little feel from other political scientists.
Russia is invading Europe in 2014. This is a big deal.
The Russian military now being directly involved in fighting Ukrainian government forces.
Satellite imagery show Russian combat units southeast of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine.
Political strategies from economic growth to anti-Western paranoia, conservative Christian orthodoxy, and a Russian imperial revival nationalism. Then jump ahead to November 2013. That's when the Ukraine crisis breaks out. You have protesters in Kiev that want to topple the pro-Russian government, replace it with a pro-European government. Putin sees this as a direct threat fomented by the Americans against Russia. When the government falls, that's when he invades to annex Crimea. He gains a huge popularity boost in Russia over this. It works out for him wonderfully politically, and he gets addicted to it. And that's why shortly after that, he starts supporting these pro-Russia separatist rebels in eastern Ukraine. The rebels take over a couple cities. Putin starts escalating. In July, he hands the rebels these very sophisticated surface-to-air missiles, which they use to shoot down Malaysian Airlines Flight 17.
U.S. officials say pro-Russian rebels are responsible.
Ukraine is fed up. The West is fed up. Ukrainian military moves in to retake these eastern cities, actually push out a number of the rebels. Putin really panics because he thinks he's going to lose everything and has bared this huge cost of economic sanctions for doing it. He couldn't afford to build up the crisis as so crucial for Russia and then just kind of watch these rebels lose. So he was pulled into an invasion that clearly is not going to work out in his long-term strategic interest. And the thing that makes that so scary is that if that's the case, that means he has no strategy, it means he has no actual objective that he's trying to achieve, and it means that there is no clear end in sight for this crisis.
And we all know about crises and wars where there's no end in sight and no clear objective. We have a couple of those ourselves.
Russia is invading.
So the Russian goals, you know, part of it is erasing the humiliation of the Soviet collapse. You know, when the Berlin Wall came down and Gorbachev ceded power and the Soviet Union broke apart into a bunch of Berserkistans, you know, that's very humiliating. He wants to recreate the Russian republics. You know, he wants to put it all back together again. He wants to be a relevant force on the world stage. And Putin wants to disrupt and weaken his perceived enemies. That's why cyber warfare is such a great tool. He can restore the glory of the Russian Empire. You saw how his popularity went way up when he started doing, you know, the Crimea annexation. So how do we decrease friction with Russia? Have we been doing a good job lately? Well, I won't even talk about the last administration, but let's talk about going forward. Is more sanctions the right answer? Well, we've sanctioned them quite a bit. We've hurt a lot of people. Do we build our own hypersonic missiles so that we can, you know, have another arms race? And especially now that we've gotten rid of the Intermediate Nuclear Arms Treaty and SALT is up for review. That's the strategic missile and nuclear response. We want to move more U.S. troops into Ukraine and into Poland and part of NATO response. Should we complain to the United Nations? Are they going to do anything? Are we going to stand by our Article 5 of the NATO commitment, which is that if one country is attacked, the other countries will go to its aid? Well, we haven't been too good sticking up with our treaties lately, but I don't know how we're going to do this going forward. But we need to do something different for sure. Because this is a hot zone. It might not be in the news today, but I have a friend who is from Donetsk in that part of Ukraine who says that her friends there say, you know, every once in a while there's still artillery and there's still snipers and there's still this. It's never ended. It's still, friction continues to go on. So let's go to number 4 because we're getting late in the morning. This is a biggie. Number 4 is China. You know, they've done new initiatives called Belt and Road across Europe and Africa to increase trade and commerce. They purchase seaports, airports, canals. They have the management company that runs the Panama Canal, believe it or not. We know they are thieves of intellectual property and data and DNA and building big databases. They have a huge internet firewall to keep information out of China. It's frustrating to go there because you have to struggle with a VPN to get any kind of news from outside. And they have a huge military buildup. They probably have more active warships today than we do. They are extending what they're doing, and they have an aggressive response into space and other areas, along with the cyber warfare areas. So what else have they done? Well, they just crushed democracy in Hong Kong this year. And this is a taste of things to come. They will tolerate no dissension. They're now exerting pressure on Taiwan, and I wouldn't be surprised if they eventually will crush Taiwan and absorb it into Greater China. They keep provoking Japan and other countries in the South China Sea, which is a terrible flashpoint. There's been aggression at the Indian border for whatever reason. We'll talk about that. And they started a trade war to punish Australia for speaking out, which is interesting. So, you know, the map of this part of the world, when you look at it, you can see China there sort of centrally located. Japan is here. Small country compared to China. The Philippines are here, Thailand, Vietnam, and India. We're going to look a little bit at this border and some of these other areas. They extend their regional control in several ways. They've done a big South China Sea buildup on little coral reefs that you could barely see before. They're starting to harass international shipping going through the South China Sea. They're trying to control the international resources there. The maritime resources there include oil and fisheries and a lot of other things that the sea provides. They started limiting aircraft overflights, which is kind of in contravention to the United Nations rules about international aircraft. And they started building ports and bases in neighboring countries, places like Djibouti, interestingly enough. So let's look at the South China Sea, very important place. Need to learn a little bit about this conflict because it's coming.
This is Fiery Cross Island. It's a little more than 1 square mile in size, and it's home to a Chinese military base. There's a 10,000-foot airstrip, an advanced radar station, a missile defense system, and about 200 troops. But the strangest thing about Fiery Cross Island is that 2 years ago, it didn't exist. And neither did the 6 other Chinese military bases that have been built on man-made islands in the South China Sea. If you look at this satellite image from 2014, you can see huge Chinese ships collecting around remote reefs in the Spratly Islands, an archipelago in the South China Sea. In this image, these ships are rapidly pumping sand and rock up onto the reef. They're building islands. And less than a year later, the Chinese had seaports, air bases, and buildings on their new island, and the world had taken notice.
We continue our look this morning at what China does not want you to see. The superpower is reclaiming land
in 7 spots in the South China Sea,
adding on average more than 3.5 acres every day.
The South China Sea is incredibly rich in natural resources. 11 billion barrels of oil, 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and 10% of the world's fisheries. Most importantly, though, 30% of the world's shipping trade flows through here. Now, every country in the South China Sea region uses this 200-mile EEZ threshold to determine its claims. All except China. China argues they have a historical claim to the South China Sea, dating back to naval expeditions in the 15th century. And they mark it using a really confusing border called the 9-dash line. They've threatened to declare an air identification zone above the South China Sea, declaring that all aircraft that fly through it would need Chinese permission. Now, publicly, China insists that their intentions are not militaristic, but their actions say otherwise.
We're going to war in the South China Sea. I was a sailor there, a naval officer. We're going to war in the South China Sea in 5 to 10 years, aren't we? There's no doubt about it.
But for now, the disputes remain only in the legal and diplomatic realms that only occasionally break into minor clashes. In July 2016, the International Court at The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines, who charged China with invading their rightful territory in the South China Sea. But China dismissed the ruling, and enforcement of the law doesn't seem likely, even from the US, who released a vague statement urging the two countries to
Yeah, we didn't support them, which is really kind of sad. So Chinese keep building and fortifying the islands, bumping U.S. ships, pursuing this air identification zone, and they're harassing the fishermen from other countries, which is a problem. So they have a strategy and planning that looks years to decades ahead. They've been thinking about this for a while. And the strategy, you know, when I think about it, I think a lot of it's a payback for colonial intervention. You know, they want to take their rightful place in world leadership, and with their growing economy, which is going to pass the U.S. soon. There's a certain sense of achieving the destiny of the Chinese race. It's a very strong driver in that part of the world. And there's a competition for the control of global resources, and that's a part of it, as well as global trade. So I want to introduce you all to a new term that some of you may or may not have heard, but I want to make sure everybody knows it: Thucydides' trap. This is a term that comes from the writings of the Athenian historian and general Thucydides, who wrote about the Peloponnesian War after he was involved in it, feeling that it had been inevitable because of the Spartan fear of growing Athenian power. And there's a tendency towards war when an emerging power threatens to displace an existing great power as the international hegemon, as we say in political science. If you go back to what we talked about earlier, one of the triggers is, you know, an upset in the balance of power can lead to conflict. Interesting. So an article in this week's Time magazine by my colleagues, Admiral James Stavridis and Elliot Ackerman, both with distinguished careers of military service, both of whom are very involved in current events and diplomacy, state that the likely flashpoint, basically, of the next global conflict is at sea over the disputed waters of the vast South China Sea. It's an excellent article, you know, that you can look up online or in this week's Time magazine. Both these guys are very sharp and somewhat better groomed than our expert that we saw in the previous video. But, you know, this is an area where the students of future conflict are very concerned that we could actually have enough friction between them trying to take over the sea lanes and the maritime resources and extending their reach beyond their coastline. Be a big problem coming for all the countries that live in that area. The question is, if they do something on Taiwan, are we going to be able to react, and could we do something that would work out? So how do we oppose Chinese hegemony? Well, let's talk about tariffs. We saw how well that worked. It crushed the U.S. pork farmers and soybean farmers. So who paid for that fiasco? Well, obviously the U.S. taxpayers, because the tariffs are passed on to those of us who buy products. And of course, all the people who lost their businesses, you know, it was a huge problem for the farmers. Should we apply more tariffs and more sanctions? Is that going to help us? I don't know. Should we insist on freedom of navigation and put more U.S. ships into harm's way in the South China Sea? That's a tough one. I'm not sure we can let this go unopposed, but I think we need to team up with our regional partners, see if our assistance maybe can give them the strength to be resistant. I don't know. Tough question. Could we have done more to support Hong Kong when they basically lost their democracy? That's a very tough question. I don't know what actions we could have done that would have turned the course of what was going on that had been well planned out by the Chinese government. Are we going to go to war to defend Taiwan? I don't know. That's something that I'm sure a lot of people are working out now to try to figure out a way out of this Thucydides trap, an emerging power that is pushing its way forward, and eventually we're going to come into conflict. So let's go to number 2. Believe it or not, this is a friction zone on the radar of a lot of military and political planners. This is huge. It's not in the sense that it's between countries like I've identified so far, but this is very likely to trigger conflict. You know, we know the warming temperatures are causing drought. All of you are aware of these things, that melting ice in the Arctic is raising the sea level, and the rising sea temperatures are disrupting the ocean ecosystems and changing the food patterns. I heard there's no kelp beds off the coast of California, something I just learned recently. There's more violent weather patterns. We've never seen hurricanes and things like we've seen. And what else has happened? Well, in addition to those bigger storms and hurricanes, we've had some crazy storm weather like derechos. I never already heard of a derecho, but now I've been schooled in that one. We've seen flooding in lots of places in the Mississippi Valley, in Louisiana, and Texas. We've seen winter freeze and snow that was just astonishing. And of course, we've got some drought in California. We're only got about 40% of our annual rainfall this year, and it's been really hot, and we've been having wildfires, as has Australia, and believe it or not, Siberia. Siberia is not a place we talk about wildfires, but let's talk about that. Why is that?
A part of the world that usually epitomizes cold is now unseasonably very, very hot. Regions of northern Siberia are routinely 10 degrees higher than usual, often cracking 30 degrees. Yakutia is a cold, wintry place, she says. I didn't think it would ever get so hot here. The implications of the heat wave for Russia's landscape are already severe. 1.7 million hectares of forest and tundra are now on fire, including some areas that are less than 15 kilometers from the Arctic Ocean.
This fire season seems to be quite extreme, so a lot of forests would be heavily damaged and destroyed.
Though there was cooler weather this week, forecast models show fires continuing to spread, and this week's blip doesn't alter the projection for more extreme Arctic weather events, as the region heats up twice as fast as the rest of the world.
Siberia. It just doesn't ring true that it's 30 degrees centigrade over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's astonishing. So is global warming a national security threat? No question. The reasons why: it's going to endanger American communities with the things we talked about: the drought, the storms, the floods, the snow, the wildfires. The food production is going to be threatened if the weather patterns change. In California's Central Valley or the Midwest, have more floods or more fires or more whatever that threatens food production. It's going to impact water supplies. We have a drought. We only got 40% of California's rainfall so far this year, and we're just about done with rain. And it's going to promote new problems. It's just going to keep changing what's going on in terms of possible epidemics and disease vectors. It's a huge problem. Let's look at one new thing.
This is Texas, but not as we know it. It should be a pleasant 10 or 15 degrees centigrade here. Instead, it's now dropping to -10 in the day, -20 at night. A state known for its sunshine and desert, now battling ice storms and plummeting temperatures.
We're talking about record-breaking cold temperatures.
All 254 Texan counties have imposed a winter storm warning. That's never happened before.
With temperatures below freezing, an hour-long wait just to get into this grocery store, and at this market, customers waited in the dark.
As power is restored, the next critical issue is water. Dozens of Texas cities seeing the taps run dry due to bursting pipes. Here in Houston, Methodist Hospital had to cancel all but the most critical of surgeries because water pressure was so low.
This is staggering. So it's a health issue, it's a food issue, it's weather colder than anybody's ever seen. Texas looking more like Siberia than Siberia does. It's astonishing. So what's the outcome if this keeps going? Well, we could have some famines around the world. There could be water shortages in critical places, particularly for growing food. That will lead to a competition in resources between peoples and groups and ethnic groups and nation states. We might wind up displacing millions more refugees, which is difficult to believe at a time when we have so many millions displaced now. And it's going to lead to conflict. There's going to be wars for resources. So this is a huge increased national security risk for the United States. It's something we've got to concentrate on. Okay, so part of our population doesn't believe in global warming. Call it the weather has changed and it's affecting our food and our security and our other issues to keep us safe. So this problem is going to downgrade our military's response capabilities as we lose some bases to flooding. That's one issue. There's a lot of others. It's going to damage the bases, impair readiness. It's going to cause mass migrations, as we talked about. It's going to increase competition for resource. So, you know, for all these reasons, this is an increase in national security risk, and it can provoke not only regional instability and conflict, but international instability and conflict. So global warming is very high on my list of threats. So do we want to take that anti-science approach? This would be the anti-science approach guy. Some of you maybe remember him from when you were younger, What Me Worry. I prefer to go with my shipmate, General James Mattis, who gave an interview on this subject when he became Secretary of Defense, and of course had to couch his terms to be politically tolerable, but still stick with the truth as a Marine general officer should. What does he say?
Very.
Climate change. When you went into government, to this office, you made a clear point about climate change, the danger, the national security threat to our bases, to our troops. Now, recently, since you've left, the Navy has rolled back an Obama-era climate commission, a task force on climate for the military. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I've not read the details of what was happening and what was rolled back, so I don't want to comment on something I'm not privy to. However, I will say that climate change, I believe, is a reality. We are dealing with open waters and where it used to be ice fields that we have to deal with. And I think that let me just talk for a moment to those who are skeptical of climate change. Wouldn't you, even if you're skeptical of it, wouldn't you want to take out an insurance policy just in case it was right? I mean, I'm not going to talk to the people who believe in climate change right now, but for those who are adamant there's no climate change, you look at the receding sea ice and have different explanations. Why wouldn't we take out an insurance policy and do prudent steps to make certain the generation that's coming up is not going to be caught flat-footed by this? It's a national security issue because when people have to leave devastated areas and move elsewhere, the refugee flows, all the humanitarian effort that goes into it, the willingness of some people to take advantage of those people, terrorists in particular, and recruit from them because they feel a loss of hope. It's a reality we're going to have to deal with.
He's an amazing guy and well stated. Should we take out an insurance policy? The new administration, as we know, has this as a top agenda item. They get it. But boy, we're behind the power curve. So should this administration subsidize renewable energy? That's something I think we need to be thinking really hard about and talking about. Should there be carbon offsets? Do we need to promote electric cars? Remember how the original low mileage, like the Prius, you got a little tax break for that. Should we be promoting? I think some of this stuff's coming. The high-speed train was a good idea. You know, they got thousands of miles of that in China. So it's very interesting that we haven't done much. You can get from Shanghai to Beijing in 4 hours on a high-speed train, and you can get from New York to Chicago in 21 hours. It's the same distance. Interesting. Do we need to switch to fake meat so we're doing less cattle farming and grain raising? I don't know. These are things that this administration, I bet, is going to tackle because they're working on things proactively as well as trying to put out the current pandemic and a lot of other problems. So let's get to kind of our biggest threat to the world's safety and security. And I think you're going to be all surprised. We've talked about some pretty big, substantial threats, but the scholars, particularly in the world that I have a few knowledge sources from, consider that the biggest threat to the world's safety and security is the conflict between India and Pakistan. Why is that? They're former colonial possessions. They have serious political differences. They have different religions. Once again, they are both nuclear powers. All these are friction points. They've had 5 previous wars, all of which have been won by India. This is the part of the world we're talking about, and India is central here. Pakistan is in the green. And we're going to look, if you follow my cursor, from India, Pakistan, we're going to talk about the provinces of Jammu and Kashmir, which are crucial to understanding. This is the UN's partition map of 1947. Where did we see that before? At that time, if you look down on the right side, the other green area, which is now Bangladesh, was gerrymandered as a separate part of Pakistan because it was primarily Muslim, whereas India is primarily Hindu. And there's been tremendous amount of ethnic strife between the two groups. So, but let's go back to Kashmir, and this is an area where there's a huge dispute over the control of Kashmir. It's ongoing and problematic. If we do a kind of focus in and zoom in on it, a couple of things, there's an area that is controlled by Pakistan up here. There's an area that's controlled by India here. And interestingly, there's a part of it that's occupied by China, which kind of makes this, again, a sort of a three-way conflict, which is going to be a problem. There have been several battles fought in this area where things were escalated to the point where both sides had actually launched airplanes between Pakistan and India and got called down and stood down at the last minute. The part of the problem is twofold. One is that Prime Minister Modi of India is promoting a Hindu first nationalism. On the other hand, you've got the Pakistani Prime Minister Khan stating that if they face loss in a war, when a nuclear armed country fights to the end, it has consequences. Wow, really? Yeah, we know that. Let's look at what he says.
अगर मसला जंग की तरफ चला गया तो याद रखें कि न्यूक्लियर हथियार हैं दोनों मुल्कों के पास और जो न्यूक्लियर जंग है वो कोई भी नहीं जीतेगा लेकिन ये नहीं कि यहां भी तबाही मचेगी ये दुनिया के ऊपर इसके असर जाएंगे
Very correct. If there is a war, no one's a winner, and if there's a nuclear war, not only is no one a winner, but it'll have very severe global consequences. It's really bad. So how do we de-escalate the India-Pakistan conflict? What are we doing here? We know that a conflict in Southwest Asia will harm the global economy and maybe harm everybody's health. The other parts of the world, in the event of a nuclear exchange, it would be devastating. Where does China fit into this? And why are they disputing part of the area of the Himalayan mountains and that border with Kashmir? I mean, why are they going to war over that? Should the USA strengthen our alliances with one party or both parties or all three parties? Or how do we de-escalate this? It's India, Pakistan, with China kind of taking advantage of their being busy. These are very tough questions. So why should we worry? Well, great powers tend to devote their diplomatic and military resources to what they see as the most serious conflicts. I'm not sure right now if the government planners see this as a serious conflict the way I do, but fortunately they have advisors who are smart guys like General Mattis and Admiral Stavridis and H.R. McMaster. Hopefully they're still listening to these guys. The less critical conflicts, Venezuela, Central America, they don't receive a lot of attention. But a disruptive conflict can erupt anywhere. The Baltics, the Koreas, India, Pakistan. I mean, so we have to keep our eye on all of these things, which is why I brought you the top 10. And if the next world war comes about, this time it could come because a non-state actor, the Islamic State, the Al-Qaeda, that somebody else does something crazy to trigger something. Because a lot of the weapons of war have managed to find their way outside of nation states, particularly when it comes to cyber and biologic warfare. So what's more worrisome? Well, we're busy. We've got a coronavirus pandemic that's weakened our economy and our democracy. It's caused disruption all over the world. And, it's kind of taken our focus away. It's hammered military readiness on a lot of aspects. It's left all the countries around the world vulnerable to being undermined or attacked by their adversaries. So, if you're busy with coronavirus, you're distracted and you're not looking at what's going on in North Korea or at the India-Pakistan border. So your attention's been diverted by that and by the rise in our own nationalism. We're kind of busy tracking down guys who invaded the Capitol, something I never thought I'd see in my lifetime in this country. It's a little crazy. And we're seeing some ethnic strife, people of Asian descent being beat up on our streets, which is a whole nother lecture we should talk about, but outside of my scope today. So there's a lot going on because our attention is diverted and strife. So what do we need to do to secure the United States against a catastrophe? Should we strengthen Latvia and the other Baltic countries against Russian invasion like we're strengthened Ukraine? Should we keep pushing back on the Chinese in the South China Sea, knowing that it's a long way from here and tough to work in their front yard? Should we go to war with Saudi Arabia to defend their oil and protect them from the Iranians and the Houthis? We want to attack Iran like Trump almost did to lessen their nuclear capability. You know, these are really, really tough questions. And right now, we've got an awful lot of different issues on our agenda to keep track of. So for this section, as we come kind of towards near the end of our morning, you know, is our military on high alert and fully capable? Do we have our eye on the ball? Maybe not. You know, we're pretty busy with the COVID thing and we haven't been doing the right building, but that's a whole nother area of discussion. Are the intelligence agencies in overdrive looking at these threats? Well, right now, we've had 4 years of the intelligence agencies being skeletonized and gutted and trashed, and we're going to have to rebuild them. We're very weak in that right now. Who are our allies? You know, it's an interesting question. We drove away the British and the Australians and the Germans and the Canadians, and you know, I think we need to rebuild our alliances. We need to get our allies back. That's the best way to probably counter Chinese expansionism, by getting our allies on board. How do we fix the India-Pakistan conflict? I'm not sure I have a good fix for that one. That's really tough. Do we have the right tools? Well, you know, we do have diplomacy, and I don't mean fire and fury diplomacy. I mean real diplomacy, like we see when, you know, a president reaches out someplace and you know, strengthens our ties, which we're just starting to see this new administration do. We need to rebuild our alliances. You know, the last administration trashed NATO and trashed Canada, trashed Mexico. You know, we need to rebuild that. We need all those people on our team. Part of what we need to do is we probably need to refurbish foreign aid. And I don't mean just pledging and giving more money, but I mean directing it to the right target so that it gets to the people who need it. You know, just like we've done with this coronavirus package that might be coming out, the American Rescue Package. We need to promote our culture, you know, whether it's, you know, sending the New York Philharmonic to play in North Korea or whatever it is that we do. American culture is a very strong force in foreign policy. And of course, our commerce is. So I don't think tariffs is the way to go in our commerce unless there's some overarching thing. We know that tariffs hastened the fall into the Depression in this country years ago, and they probably didn't help this time. So, and I think education, you know, we've educated a lot of foreign students in this country, and I think for the most part, that has been to our benefit, making friends and strengthening alliances and building bridges. So I'm going to take a few minutes for your questions, and, you know, I'm going to open the chat room for a couple of questions, and then, as I often say, there's just one more thing. So if you want to know how bad the India-Pakistan problem can get, Dr. Winnig recommends watching Mango Dreams on Netflix, which is available until March 13th. It is a great suggestion. Mango Dreams on Netflix. Yeah, I think good point. Thank you for bringing that up. So a couple other questions. With Poland and the other Baltic countries seeking U.S. military basing, what is my fear? Well, my fear is, and that's a great question from a fellow Navy officer, I think it's really hard to, I would have to sit down with the map and with the players and look at the other NATO countries. I think this is a NATO issue. It's not a U.S. versus the Russians issue. I think we and NATO need to get together in one sheet of music with one game plan and really make those ties tight. You know, the real problem is very difficult for us to figure out how would we respond, because just like if we went to war with China on the other side of the world, we're not going to get there till very late, and it's going to be hard to do it. The same is true with Russia. So, you know, forward-basing alliances, strengthening our allies, there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle, but we are in a weak spot right now, absolutely. In any event, I've got, that was my last question that I think I see on the board. So I'm going to go on. Oh, got one from Mr. Tom. How do you see the JCPOA? We really stepped on our feet on that one. So the JCPOA is our 6-party treaty that prevented the Iranians from getting nuclear weapons and allowed inspections. And of course, the former administration abruptly withdrew by tweet. This is how we do some of our diplomacy previously. And we need to get back to the bargaining table. Are we ever going to get Iran to disarm? Maybe not. Just like with North Korea, they may never give it up because they don't trust us. You know, we got Libya to disarm and then, you know, knifed Gaddafi. So maybe the real key here is to establish commerce and trade and diplomacy and do all the things that make it beneficial for people to work together. I think that's really where we got to go. So great, thanks. That's an excellent question. Again, I really believe that, you know, good diplomacy and properly applied foreign aid and using our cultural leverage, whether it's Kentucky Fried Chicken or Baskin Robbins, which I see all over the world along with Starbucks, that is where we are strong. We need to play to our strengths. So great questions, I appreciate it. And there's just one more thing that I got to send, because so I really hate to end a lecture thinking about all the things that I told you today. My friends say this is why I don't sleep well at night, because I think about and study all this stuff and worry about it. But my kids also tell me that we, our generation, most of you watching today are my generation, have left a mess for them and for future generations. And I think it's something we have to work on and think about, and maybe empower some of these young people. So I want to do that, a couple of clips, so you can hear from some of these young people who impress me and give me hope. So here's one who said we made a mess of it.
This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? You are failing us. But the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you. And if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you.
Pretty tough, but she's, I think that recitation of the facts from her is pretty strong, but I think there's change coming. And I think the next generation is stepping up, and they're different. They're going to change the trend lines in the course of the arc of history, I think. They're very much connected to the global commons in a way that we aren't, through the internet and all the things that they do. And they also have literally mankind's knowledge at their fingertips. You don't have to walk to the library for the encyclopedia to work on your term paper. It's in their phone. Pretty amazing. And they're interested in service, which gives me hope, because that's something that makes me think that they will be able to help change the future and change the course of some of these conflicts. So let's look at another one of those. How do I make this end on a positive note? Well, more of my next generation rock stars.
It is for those forgotten children who want education. It is for those frightened children who want peace. It is for those voiceless children who want change. I'm here to stand up for their rights, to raise their voice. It is not time to pity them. It is not time to pity them. It is time to take action.
So let's hear a little more. I've got a couple that are my favorites that I think would be good to hear from. An amazing young man, prior military service, with some ideas. Oop, where'd he go?
So today, I'm proud to announce a new call for service with 3 major steps. 1, we propose to immediately triple paid service opportunities, to bring them to 250,000 opportunities targeted toward America's high school graduates, community college, and vocational students. I believe by 2026, when we're going to have a very big 4th of July, because it's the 250th birthday of this country, that by then, we can invest so that 1 million high school graduates have an opportunity for a full year of service to their community and to their country.
So when he was running for office and he made that statement, I realized he could see it. He knew how important that is. And last, sometimes I just look at these young kids, like all the ones that I just showed you, and they leave me with awe.
Mr. President, Dr. Biden, Madam Vice President, Mr. Emhoff, Americans, and the world. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, in the norms and notions of what just isn't always just is. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. We, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother can dream of becoming president, only to find herself reciting for one. And yes, we are far from polished, far from pristine, but that doesn't mean we are striving to form a union that is perfect. We are striving to forge our union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. And so we lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first, we must first put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true. That even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, that even as we tired, we tried, that we'll forever be tied together, victorious, not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. That is the promise to glade the hill we climb if only we dare it, because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. And this effort very nearly succeeded. But while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. In this truth, in this faith we trust, for while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. This is the era of just redemption. We feared it at its inception. We did not feel prepared to be the heirs of such a terrifying hour, but within it we found the power to author a new chapter, to offer hope and laughter to ourselves. So, while once we asked, how could we possibly prevail over catastrophe? Now we assert, how could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be, a country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free. We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. Our blunders become their burdens, but one thing is certain. If we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left. With every breath from my bronze-pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the gold-limbed hills of the West. We will rise from the wind-swept Northeast, where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked South. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover in every known nook of our nation, in every corner called our country. Our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade of flame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.
Wow. How do you beat that? When I was young, it was the adults that were my heroes. And now, really, it's the kids that are my heroes. So I am going to do my best to see if I can tidy up this lecture and filter out some of the earlier noise. And then I will send all of you a link so that if there's parts of it you want to see again, and for those who didn't make it this morning to view it, and I will take care of that later. I want to thank everybody for your time this morning and for listening to my thoughts and ideas on this subject. And as always, you're welcome to email me for further discussion. Have a safe day and be careful out there.